Every time he came back, he got worse. His skin seemed to grow deadly pale and his teeth sharper.
Hi, I am crazy. I am schizophrenic Steve. Last year I participated for 6 months in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in the local paper looking for creative people who wanted to make good money, and since it was the only ad that matched my qualifications, I called them and was set up for an interview. I was told that all I had to do was sit alone in a room with sensors attached to my head that would record my brain activity. While in the room, I had to mentally imagine my double. They called this project Tulpa. It seemed easy enough to me, and I agreed once I found out how much I would be paid for it. The next day I got to work. They took me into the room where the bed was and attached sensors to my head and connected them to a small black box on the table next to the bed. I was told that I had to imagine a visual image of my double, and it was explained that if I got tired, or bored, instead of moving, I should imagine my double walking around the room, try to talk to him, that sort of thing. The idea was to have him in the room with me all the time. The first few days I had trouble. It took more effort than the simple daydreaming I had indulged in before. I imagined my doppelganger for a few minutes, but then I began to get distracted. On the 4th day, however, I was able to imagine his presence for the entire 6 hours. I was told that I was doing very well. A week later I was moved to another room with wall speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could represent the tulpa despite distracting stimuli. The music they were running was unpleasant, disgusting and disturbing, and presenting my visual image became a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week they ran even more disturbing music with squeaks. The background of this music resembled the sound of an old modem dialing, and a guttural voice saying something in some foreign language. I only laughed it off. By then I was a professional. After about a month, I began to get bored. To entertain myself somehow, I started talking to my doppelganger. We started talking or playing rock paper scissors, or I imagined him juggling or breakdancing or whatever else I could think of. I asked the researchers if my childishness would bother them, but they approved of my actions. We continued to play and chat, and it was fun for a while. Then something strange started to happen. One day I was telling him about my first date and he corrected me. I said my girlfriend was wearing a yellow top and he said it was green. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. I got creepy, and after my shift I talked to the researchers about it. You use thought patterns to access your subconscious, they explained to me. At some level of your subconscious you realized you were wrong, and your subconscious corrected you. What I thought was creepy suddenly turned out to be hilarious. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could ask questions of my tulpa and access any depths of my memory. I could quote whole pages from books I had read years ago, remember things I had been taught that I had immediately forgotten about in school. It was amazing. It was around this time that I started summoning my doppelganger outside the research center. Not often at first, but I got so used to imagining him that now I felt uncomfortable when he wasn't around. So whenever I got bored, I imagined my doppelganger. Eventually, I started doing it almost constantly. It was fun to keep him around as an invisible friend. I imagined him when I hung out with friends, took him to meet my mom, and once I even took him on a date with me. I know it sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he the repository of all the information I had once known and forgotten, he sometimes seemed more interested in me than I was in him. He also had an uncanny ability to recognize body language that I wasn't even aware of. For example, I thought the date I took him on went poorly, but he noted that the girl laughed too hard at my jokes, reached for me when I talked, and a bunch of other little things I hadn't noticed. I listened and made sure the date went pretty well. I had been at the research center for 4 months by then, and he was with me all the time. One day after my shift, the researchers came up to me and asked if I had stopped representing him. I said no, and they seemed pleased. I quietly asked my double if he knew what that would mean, but he just shrugged. I didn't understand anything either. I fell out of the world a bit at this point. I found it hard to communicate with people. They seemed so stupid and insecure to me, whereas I could always consult with myself. It made me feel uncomfortable. No one seemed to know at all why they did the things they did, what drove their actions, why some things drove them crazy and others just made them laugh. They didn't know what drove them. But I knew at least I could ask myself and get an answer. One night a friend came barging in on me. He broke in the door before I had even fully opened it. He was furious. "You haven't been answering my calls for weeks, you goddamn asshole," he yelled. "What the hell kind of trouble are you in?" I was about to apologize to him, and maybe we would have continued that evening drinking together at the bar, but my tulpa suddenly went into an indescribable rage. "Hit him," he said, and no sooner had I realized what I was doing than I struck my friend. I heard his nose break. He fell down, and then jumped up and came at me with his fists, and we fought, beating each other and turning the whole apartment upside down. I had never been so furious before, and I was ruthless. I knocked him down and kicked him twice in the ribs. He ran away, bent over and sobbing. The police arrived a few minutes later, but I told them he was the one who had started the fight, and since he wasn't there to refute me, they just gave me a warning. My tulpa was smiling the whole time. We spent the night discussing my victory and laughing about how well I had done my friend. The next morning, when I saw my black eye and split lip in the mirror, I realized what had caused the fight. It was my doppelganger, not me, who had become enraged. I felt guilty, I even felt a little ashamed, but he had made me start a fight with an old friend. He was there for me, and of course he heard my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt goosebumps run down my spine. I told the researchers who worked with me about it, but they just mocked me. "You can't be afraid of what you imagine," one of them said. My double stood next to him and nodded, then grinned at me. I tried to follow their advice, but for the next few days I became more and more anxious about my tulpa. He seemed to begin to change. He grew taller and looked more threatening. Mischief glittered in his eyes, and malice lurked in his constant smile. I decided that no job was worth losing my mind over. If I couldn't control him, I had to get rid of him. By then I was so used to it that the visualization process was automatic, and I began to do my best not to imagine it. It took a few days, but it started to work. I could get rid of him for a few hours a day. But every time he came back, he got worse. His skin seemed to turn deadly pale and his teeth sharper. He hissed and threatened and swore. The disturbing music I had been listening to for months now accompanied him everywhere. Even at home, when I relaxed and forgot myself, not concentrating on not seeing him, he appeared, and that awful music along with him. I still went to the research center and spent 6 hours at a time. I needed the money, and I assumed that no one was aware that I wasn't presenting my tulpa now. I was wrong. One day after my shift, when it had been 5.5 months, 2 huge orderlies grabbed me, and someone in a white coat gave me a shot. I woke up again in the room, strapped to the bed. The music was roaring, and my double was standing over me, smirking. He didn't look human anymore. His limbs were strangely twisted. His eyes were buried deep in his eye sockets, like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were crooked and his nails looked more like claws. In short, he was scary as hell. I tried to get rid of him, but I couldn't concentrate. He laughed and patted my shoulder. I was kicking at the bed as hard as I could, trying to get out, but I hardly even moved. They got you full of good shit. How's your head? Is it all blurry? He leaned closer and closer, saying this. I held my breath, his mouth reeked of rotten meat. I tried to concentrate, but I couldn't chase it away. The next few weeks were horrible. Some doctor would come to me and inject me with something or force-feed me pills. They kept me in such a state that I couldn't concentrate. Sometimes I started hallucinating. My thought image was still around, smirking all the time. It interacted with my delirium. I thought my mother was in the room, scolding me, and then he would come up behind me and cut her throat, and her blood would drip on me. It was so real that I felt like I could taste the blood. The doctors never spoke to me. Sometimes I begged them, I screamed, I spit out pills, I demanded them to answer me. They didn't talk to me. They were talking to my tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure, maybe it was caused by the drugs, maybe I was deluded, but I remember them talking to him. There was a growing conviction in me that he was the real one, and I was his thought image. He supported this idea while ridiculing everything else. Another thing that seemed delusional to me was that he could touch me. And even more, he could hurt me. He would push and kick me when he thought I wasn't paying much attention to him. One time he grabbed my balls, twisted them, and held them like that until I told him I loved him. Another time he scratched my forearm with his claw. I still have a scar in that spot, constantly convincing myself that I hurt myself, and no hallucination was responsible. All the time. And then one day, as he was telling me about how he was going to get everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he stopped. A puzzled look appeared on his face, and he reached out and touched my forehead, just like my mother did when I had a fever. He sat like that for a long time, and then he smiled. All thoughts are material, he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later I was injected and passed out. When I woke up, I was free. Shivering, I went to the door. It was unlocked. I stepped out into the deserted hallway, and I ran. I fell more than once, but I went down the stairs and out into the parking lot behind the building. There I collapsed, crying like a baby. I knew I had to go, but I couldn't. Eventually, I got home. I don't remember how I did it. I locked the door, covered it with a dresser, and slept for a day and a half. No one came for me that night, or the next day, or later. It was over. I spent a week locked in my room, but it felt like an eternity. I had broken off relations with everyone long before these events, so no one noticed I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. No documents were found. The names I gave turned out to be fictitious. I suspect that even the source of the money I received could not be traced. I recovered, if you can call it that. I don't leave the house often, and sometimes I have panic attacks. I scream. I can't sleep for a long time. My nightmares are horrible. It's over, I compel myself. I am a survivor. I use the techniques those bastards taught me to convince myself of that. Sometimes it works. But not today. 3 days ago, my mother called me. Tragedy had struck. My sister was the victim of a serial killer, the police said. The killer is releasing his victim's intestines to the outside. The funeral was this afternoon. It went as well as a funeral can go, I think. However, I got a little distracted. From somewhere in the distance I heard music. Disgusting, disturbing music, and squeaks and modem connection sounds. I can still hear those sounds, louder this time.
If you liked the story, please subscribe and like. Till tomorrow.